At first glance, this just looks like your run-of-the-mill Hewlett-Packard pre-built. But what if I told you for around $300, this packs a Core i5, a GTX 1660 Super, 16 gigs of DDR3, okay, there's a sign of what's to come, and a little over 3 terabytes worth of storage, and an optical drive. I can't go without saying that. And at first glance, it might appear risky, buying something labeled an HP gaming PC desktop computer, and then a bunch of specs also included in the title of the listing. You can see the price currently is around 300 or so USD. The original list price was a little over $400, which I wouldn't have personally entertained given the specs that are disclosed. This begs the question then, did I get ripped off? Probably. We're gonna find out in this video. Stay with me. If you're sick of seeing that same Activate Windows watermark over and over, head on over to VIP SCD Key, where they have Windows 10 and 11 Pro OEM keys at a fraction of the price of retail. Just use a secure payment method like PayPal, enter your product key into your PC settings window, and say bye-bye to the watermark. And be sure to use our offer code SKGS for that sweet discount. Now, first impressions out of the box, I want to show you what this was packaged in. So just your typical case box, and then we had just the regular case foam to kind of soften the blow. I think this is not the correct way to put this on, but you get the idea. So this is how it was shipped. And then inside, we did take a peek, you actually have an inflatable Z-Pack, which is great for shipping anything with a graphics card sticking out of it and a fairly large CPU cooler. So these things will actually expand. You just have to pop a couple bubbles, you put the case panel back on, and then this thing fills up all of the empty space. If you're looking to ship a system, you don't want to take the graphics card out, although I still recommend you do that, throw one of these in there. We take this out, and well, you'll probably notice right off the bat that this is a very old system. For starters, you'll notice this rather basic Intel cooler, and underneath what I expect to be either a Core i5 2500 or maybe something like a 3470. We'll verify momentarily. I thought this was interesting. Took the DDR3 out, and you can see one of these DIMMs is not like the other. So I imagine these two were from the system originally. Skytech just kept these in, and then they added 2 additionals, but they don't match. So it's not the end of the world, but this is just stuff you're gonna see in cheaper repurposed pre-builts like these. You'll notice on the power supply side, this is an 80 plus platinum unit, which is pretty darn impressive for an HP OEM PSU like this. Now, a lot of folks actually defend these in comment sections on Discord. Folks like these HP pre-builts. I'm not sure if this specific power supply is one that they like to brag about, but it's worth noting that some of these are actually pretty darn reliable. And this one is a 320 watt unit, which I think is still fine for this older Core i5 and its 1660 Super. Cutting it pretty close, yes, but again, $300 system. Now this one I'm super curious about, the graphics card, supposedly a 1660 Super. I can't tell from here what brand 1660 Super it is though. Is there an easy way to take this card? There we go. And STG. What does it say on the sticker? Oh, hold on a second here. It's a 1660 Ti. That's actually a small upgrade. I'm not gonna complain, but everywhere on the Amazon page, it either says 1660, actually now that I'm looking at the Amazon page again, 1660 here, but then 1660 Super somewhere else in the description. This makes no sense. A little sketchy, but at least the actual physical card in the system is a bit better than either of those listed. So yeah, that's okay. I'm curious, I'm gonna try taking off this sticker if there is another company logo underneath this. So I really wanna know who manufactures this. And this might just be like a, I don't know, like an HP version of a 1660 or 1660 Ti, I guess. But yeah, it looks like Skytech just kind of slapped their logo on. And of course, there's nothing underneath. All right, well, that was pointless. And of course, you can see right away, this is an HP branded motherboard, which means you will probably run into some proprietary issues if you try to take this out or replace it with something else. And that's mainly because this rear IO shield is not removable. It's baked into the chassis, which means you either have to use a Dremel or just deal with the cutouts as they are if you decided to replace the motherboard in here. Please don't do either of those things. That would be pretty cringe. Just get yourself a new case. It is helpful though that Skytech included these yellow stickers to point out that you should not be connecting your display cable to the motherboard display port or HDMI port. You should be connecting it to a discrete card. And that's a rule of thumb for any gamer who's first connecting a system and wants to have picture out. Don't plug it in up here if you have a discrete card. Use your graphics card, it's gonna be much better in most cases. And lastly here, before we power the system on, the 512 gig SSD is down here. This is from King, actually, I didn't realize this was not a familiar brand, King Fast. It's not King Stun, it's King Fast. Just in case you were wondering. It is a 512 gig SSD, apparently. And then this is a 3 terabyte hard disk drive from HEST. Now, the one concern I have that Raymond so graciously pointed out, this is a hard drive from December 2012, which means it probably doesn't have a lot of life left. I suppose this would also be a good time to mention that this pre-built ships with a keyboard and a mouse. It also shipped with a power cable, which is, it's nice. Sometimes that's an afterthought for some of these companies. And well, it was, I think, supposed to also ship with an HDMI cable, but instead we got a second power cable. These I'm just gonna set aside for now. Power button is, found it. That's where it is. You know, it boots up really quick. And I was a bit concerned that it was gonna sound rough because some of the comments I was reading on the Amazon product page suggested that this rig vibrates loudly. It just runs crazy hot. I mean, I'm sure it's gonna run a bit hot, but so far, it actually sounds pretty good, and it does look like it's booting into Windows. If you're wondering, Windows is supposedly activated as well, so there's a lot of stuff that's already taken care of, as you would expect from any other pre-built, even though this is essentially a recycled pre-built from HP. And there we go, yeah, we're straight into Windows. That was a very seamless boot process. And yes, we're plugged into the graphics card, so that on the surface appears to be working as well. What also seems to be working is the RGB that was added after the fact. You probably can't see it much from there. I'll flip this forward for you. Yeah, some built-in rainbow stuff. Although I will say from the top down through these grills, the LEDs actually diffuse nicely. It looks like Skytech put a bit of effort into this. Just the aesthetic, you know, qualities of a pre-built are pretty lackluster most of the time. This is a nice touch though. I'm not gonna complain one bit. Now, something that isn't great about this so far, we've noticed, is the clipping noise coming from this hard disk drive. I got my lav mic just kind of chilling here. I apologize if it sounds a bit cringy when I move it, but I want you guys to hear what I'm hearing. Yeah, that ain't good. So yeah, comments like these definitely seem to be legit. This person thought it was one of the SATA drives, and sure enough, at least in our case, it was. I am curious about this keyboard quality. I imagine it won't be all that great because of the sheer price of this whole setup. And well, it feels like a membrane keyboard, not surprising. It also feels oddly familiar, like my middle school keyboard. You know what I'm talking about? Like those old Dell keyboards you used to have in like middle school and high school. Anyway, that's what this feels like, but at least you get something. I'm not gonna complain. Again, the price pretty much reflects the quality. And in case you're wondering, the mouse isn't much better. I really wanna run this over with my truck. It will explode. Glorious pieces everywhere. I really wanna do it. Can we do it, Raymond? Please. Can we run this over?
Maybe after the video.
The people have spoken. I heard them say it. They want us to run it over. Let's go.
12 seconds later.
You sure we don't want to get any more B-roll shots of that?
Sure.
Okay.
We're locked and loaded, boys. Yeah, that's about what I expected. It's just 99% cheap plastic. Now right away, after booting into Windows, I wanted to see what CPU we have in here, and we can easily tell by downloading CPU-Z. So this is actually an Intel Core i5-4590, which is a bit newer than I was suspecting. I completely forgot that Haswell was still on DDR3. I was expecting this to be either a Sandy Bridge or an Ivy Bridge chip, but this is actually sort of kind of refreshing. It's still a very old CPU, still stuck on 4 cores with no hyper-threading, but I'll take this as a win in a $300 budget. Next up, I downloaded GPU-Z, and just to see what sort of AIB we were working with, since it wasn't actually labeled anywhere on the shroud. This appears to be an MSI sub-vendor, which, well, I mean, you guys know how I feel about MSI. It doesn't really matter in this context. I was just curious. So in case you are wondering, if you happen to buy this on Amazon, MSI is likely the 1660 Ti you will get. Now up first, as usual, for performance metrics, I wanted to run 3D Mark Time Spy, a 1440p DX12 synthetic, and this computer actually handled it quite well. Playback was actually fairly smooth up until the physics part where the CPU is being heavily stressed, but scoring better than 21% of all submitted results, again, for a $300 system, we have to keep that context in our minds, is actually pretty darn good. This is probably one of the best scoring $300 systems I've ever worked with. You can see our graphics score is just over 6,000, the CPU score is just under 3,000, which represents sort of a big kind of chasm between the performance of the two. The CPU is definitely the bottleneck in most situations here, being a much older 4th generation Intel Core i5, but still, again, for the money, I have no real complaints. Now up first for some actual games, F1 23, as usual, 1080p. This is the medium preset with only TAA enabled. We don't have, obviously, ray tracing or anything to enable here because our card is a bit too old, a bit too weak for that, but that's, again, totally understandable in this budget. You can see our frame rate's around 100 FPS, which is pretty darn good here in the Australia wet map. You can see the usage on our CPU side is quite high, which we shouldn't really be all that surprised by, but still relatively balanced in this title because our graphics card is also being leveraged around 70 to 80%. So I think the right mix of in-game settings could work for a build like this, which is kind of surprising, seeing as though this game is so much newer than the hardware inside the rig. Star Wars Battlefront 2, though, was a slightly different story. I actually expected this to perform better than F1 23, but you can see even in the main menu, our CPU utilization is, well, off the charts. 100% loading into the actual match is pretty awful. I thought our frame rate would clean up just a tad once we started moving, and that appeared to be the case, at least in the beginning, around 100 FPS or so, but once the action started, we began noticing pretty awful frame time spikes, essentially stutters, this like severe lag in game where it seems like the image is freezing for, you know, several milliseconds, where it's noticeable to the human eye. And at some points we were even seeing frame time spikes as high as 500 milliseconds or more, which makes this rather unplayable. And this is only 1080p, again, medium preset. We aren't even enabling the DX12 API here. So a pretty shoddy performance here, all things considered. That said, you could of course drop the resolution, or better yet, maybe even bump some in-game settings to sort of artificially lower your frame rate. That should offset some of that workload to your graphics card and give your CPU a bit of a breather. We ran into this with some other builds as well recently on the channel, where actually playing at a higher resolution can give you a smoother experience because your CPU isn't struggling as much to keep up with the higher frame rate. And this became even more apparent in Grand Theft Auto 5, where again, I thought this system would actually do quite well because a lot of these components were pretty popular around the time GTA 5 first launched on the PC. But you can see again, all 4 of our CPU cores are pegged at 100% utilization. Now temperatures throughout all of these tests, I should note, we're actually decent, around 60, 65 degrees Celsius at peak. Same goes for our graphics card. You can see our usage on the GPU side of things is fairly low, so our temperature is not high, but still wanted to point out that the system remained relatively quiet throughout these benchmarks. You can see that that utilization on the CPU side of things is really choking our visual experience here. A lot of frame time spikes, upwards of a second or so, sometimes even more than that. And then you notice later on when we get to the ground scene that some textures just aren't even loading in, a sign that our CPU is really struggling to keep up with the frames that our graphics card is drawing. But to piggyback off of our discussion earlier, by sort of artificially lowering our frame rate, either by bumping the resolution or enabling something like VSync, as we did here, we can actually enjoy a smoother playback. So our CPU usage is still at 100% for all 4 threads, but with VSync enabled, locked to around 60 FPS, you can see we have very minimal frame time spikes, much smoother experience, even on the ground scene. In fact, we don't even see the missing textures that we saw earlier on the ground level. So if this is something that you're interested in, if you want to buy a $300 system like this, just consider things like VSync. Don't expect to be able to game at 100 or more FPS. It's just going to prove too taxing for a CPU this old. Still though, 60 FPS, GTA 5, 1080p medium settings for a $300 rig. I think that's perfectly fine. And I think that perfectly sums up my impressions of this pre-built. Perfectly fine. It's not obviously going to change the world. It's not going to radically, I don't know, alter the way that you play games. But for anyone who's just starting out and who only has a few $100 to spare and wants to take a chance on an older rig like this, we took a chance just like I imagine you would if you happen to buy it. And I've got to say, for $300, she ain't that bad. I didn't think I'd be saying that at the end of this video, but you know, small discrepancies aside, I'm pretty impressed. Now I have to address this because I feel like it always comes up in the comment sections of videos like these where we're obviously very tight budget-wise, and you're thinking, okay, well, if you buy a platform like this, you've pretty much hit a dead end right out of the gate. Why would you recommend a rig like this to someone who might potentially want to upgrade down the line? They're going to have to completely overhaul everything, at which point they might as well just scrap this rig and start fresh. Isn't that a waste of money? And I've got to say, in budgets this tight, I don't think you should be prioritizing an upgrade path of really any kind. I think you should be just maximizing value for the dollar spent in the now, because you just can't afford to. I mean, what platform would you put in here that would fit under a $300 budget that would still be upgradable? I guess you could kind of go with maybe AM4. That's still already a dated platform at this point. You could go with something from Intel, but Intel's not as great about, upgrade paths, at least when it comes to their motherboards. So you really don't have much of a choice here. I say just get the most expensive platform you can, pair that with a pretty decent graphics card, and you've got a winner for a dirt cheap price point. $300 is cheaper than a modern console today. And while it might not game as well as a modern console, you can do a lot more with it than just game, which I think is the appeal of a system this cheap. I'm curious at this point what you guys think. I wonder if I'm being too soft on this. I think because I used my own money, I'm maybe just internally trying to find validation, but I mean, I'll openly roast whatever I have to, whether I've spent the money myself or not. You guys have seen that before on the channel. I've just been impressed with this one for the most part, and I'm curious what you guys think as well. So leave a comment down below if you haven't already. Consider subscribing if you haven't. I'm not sure why I'm giving a thumbs up. I haven't said that part yet. Give the video a thumbs up if you thought it was cool. And yeah, stick around for the next one. I think we're gonna buy something else similar to this on Amazon. Now, if you have something else you want us to check out, if you want us to buy maybe a sketchy pre-built listing from Amazon or somewhere, this is gonna open the floodgates, right? I'm gonna get ready for the inquiries. But just, yeah, link those maybe in the comment section, and we'll do our best to sniff them out. This one for me is a pass. I can't say that this will always be the case. We didn't, reach out to them and let them know who we were or anything. So this was just an off-the-shelf purchase. But this one's shockingly good for the price, at least. So that's it for this one. We're gonna get out of here. Again, thanks so much for watching, and thanks for learning with me.